Good evening, everybody. Really fantastic to see everybody here this evening. Isn't it wonderful that we can meet again like this and enjoy each other's company and enjoy a live presentation? We've had a very successful year of Zoom talks, but it's really wonderful that we're back here in Routh Hall for this presentation, and it is the 35th annual lecture, Bromsgrove annual lecture, so we're really delighted that we're continuing this tradition of holding the lecture here at Bromsgrove School. And this evening I'm delighted that Aidan Rudyard is with us. I had a great conversation with Aidan at the start of the year to talk about the lecture and to talk about his thoughts of what he wanted to talk about this evening. And I think the topic of creative conservation is very much akin with the Bromsgrove Society. Our motto is pride, preservation and progress, and I think that links very well with the idea of conservation, but in a creative way. So we're moving forward, progressing, but keeping the pride and preserving our heritage. So yes, delighted to welcome Aidan this evening, who I'll now hand over to. Aidan, thank you very much.
Thank you and good evening. I've got to begin by saying how flattered I am to be asked to speak to the Bromsgrove Society. I'm absolutely delighted that you've asked me to talk to you. And when Joe said, what did I want to talk about, I thought we ought to discuss issues around conservation, because I think at the moment it's an issue which designers are approaching in increasingly different ways, some of which are positive, some of which are less positive. And I wanted to talk to you about how we deal with it as a practice and how, through probably 5 projects, we've approached it in different ways. You'll see buildings you like, and you'll see buildings that you don't like. And each of them has an issue about conservation and how we approach that. But I think incumbent on us in the 21st century now is a responsibility to think about the sustainability of the building stock we have. And by demolishing something, you reject that and you waste materials and you waste resources. We have to be clever about how we find new lives for things. And hopefully that's what I'm going to show you this evening. So, to begin with, let me tell you a little bit about our practice. Are we moving slides? No, we're not moving slides. Let's try this one. There we go. I kind of always describe us as being the practice who does difficult things. The nice side of that is that we're always helping interesting clients in interesting places. And we tend to be helping them produce projects which make a difference. And that's something which I really enjoy doing. Now, tonight I'm going to show you 5 projects. And they span around about 2,000 years of history on the sites in which they are located. And each of them brings a different kind of spin to how we approach that issue of conservation. Each one has different challenges and potentially different rewards. A couple are finished, a couple are on site at the moment, and a couple are one's in planning at the moment. So it gives you a spread. So I'm going to begin with the Winter Gardens in Great Yarmouth, which is the last Victorian Winter Gardens building in a British coastal city that's surviving. And there's a little picture of it. As you can see, it does exactly what it says on the tin. It is a winter garden. It is a big glass building with an iron frame, built in, I think it was 1897, and it sits on the seafront in Yarmouth. Now, interestingly, this building started its life in Torquay and got put onto a barge and shifted to Yarmouth when the citizens of Torquay decided it was slightly below them to have a winter garden in their town. They thought they would export it to the East Coast. The East Coast are delighted with it. It was a roller disco, it was a winter garden, it was a ballroom. It's done just about everything in its 100 or so years in Great Yarmouth. But now it's falling into a bit of disrepair, and we need to think about how we find a new use for a really big glass building. Scale, probably twice the size of the space we're in at the moment, with a tower that goes up probably twice the height. So when we begin looking at these things, we kind of tend to do little sketches, as all designers do, and think about what's important, getting back to that core of what the building is. Getting rid of all those things that have grown up around it over the years, which kind of distract slightly, and you've got a very simple thing at its heart. If we can take it back to the simple thing, it will probably succeed. So if we can take it back to that, we've then got a series of functions that we need to put into it to give it a viable future. And in this case, it's about creating a visitor centre, it's about creating a restaurant, it's about creating something that helps support education for young people in Great Yarmouth. And part of doing that is about the cycle of growing things that you eat. So food growth, plants, eat it, healthy living, it's a virtuous circle. And if you put that into a greenhouse, what's there not to like? All is great until you want to sit down and have a meal in December in a greenhouse. Now, we can solve that in many ways, putting energy into the building, but that's not really what we want to do in a sustainable world. We need to find clever ways to make that climate work for itself. More of that later. In practical terms, we've got a Victorian iron frame building which is deteriorating rapidly in a coastal climate. It needs major restoration. As you can see from that drawing, there's a lot of metalwork in there, all of which has got to be stripped back and conserved and repaired and put back into commission. As I said, we don't want to kind of make this a building which is going to suck energy in and waste it. We need to find clever ways to do it. And for most of the year, because it's glass, it's actually gaining energy. It's those winter days where it's got problems. So the philosophy we took forward was to actually look at, rather than heating the building, heat the people. So where we put seating into it, almost like you have heated seats in a car, look at actually putting low-level heating into the things that people are actually sitting in, so we warm them where they sit, rather than trying to warm the building itself. As soon as the sun comes out, we get solar gain, and we've got enough energy that we can move around the building. And if we use air source heat pumps, again, we've got really green energy that we can pump around the building. As I say, it's a greenhouse, it's about plants. And one of the interesting things with Yarmouth is that as a port, its connections were with South Africa. So actually the planting scheme that we're putting back into it is, apart from the things that you eat, are a whole load of African plants that make that connection between the trade routes, and again, plugging that back into the education mission that they're trying to put through that building. So by putting things into it, we begin to build up a green building with a series of spaces which are about things that you eat, things that are growing, things that tie into the history of the town and its port and its connections around the world. And it builds up that language within the volume. Under the kind of glass dome there, you can see we've tried to create a little mini theatre like the space we're in at the moment, where you can actually have events, music, performance, bring school kids in there and they can actually hear about the history of their community. And placing that kind of topography within that glass house is going to be something which we're really excited about. And I think it's the idea of something which is living and vibrant and people are using being the reason that we're actually conserving the historic building itself is what we got so excited about. Now, we worked really hard on this last year, and we put in a bid to the government through the Heritage Lottery Fund. 12 bids went in, 4 were going to be successful, and fortunately, we were one of the 4, so yay, we've got the funding. I must never complain about the government again because they give us funding for things, and we're hopefully going to be taking this one forward this year, so very excited about Great Yarmouth. Now, second project I'm going to show you is very different. This is for the Royal Society of Arts in London. And this is their headquarters in John Adams Street. It's a very, very beautiful Georgian building. It's listed grade 1, 2-star and 2. You've got the full set, as we say in the conservation world. It's an amazing building. But even more amazing was the brief that they gave us, which was that they wanted to reinvent the 18th century coffee house for the 21st century. How cool a brief is that? Absolutely fabulous. That place where people would come together to discuss ideas, that's been happening in that building for 250 years. How do we reinvent that for the 21st century? Some things have stayed the same. You will notice the coffee is still an integral part of that conversation, but there's also things like Wi-Fi and co-working and things like that that bring people together. And again, it's about looking at how a historic building can become the foundation for a group of people coming together to share ideas, which is just a great brief to work with. So, the building itself is, you can see there along the street frontage, 4 stories plus an attic, typical London 18th century terrace of buildings. But what you don't realise is because this is in the Adelphi, there's another 3 stories below street level, going right down to Thames level. And those are the vaults where goods would have come in from the Port of London, would have been stored in those vaults. And we're 200 metres back from the river here, and it keeps going. There's a massive sort of false landscape has been built on that northern embankment. And down below street level is where the fellows areas are. Now combine that with a building which is split into slices, almost like you're slicing a cake. You've got 2 conflicting geometries. You've got one which is taking you down vertically and one which is splitting you up horizontally. And a lot of the challenge of the project was about how we manage that, how we move from slice to slice to slice across the building. Lovely architectural phrase, in enfilade. It's that kind of sight line that goes from one building to the next, to the next, to the next, and how you can work with those geometries. Secondly, how we can move people up and down throughout the building so you've got that vertical movement as well. A common theme with all of these projects is kind of choreography and that idea about moving people, which is something we're very interested in. And at the RSA, there were 2 spaces where people could move vertically, one of which was a sort of traditional staircase, and the other one was a volume carved out of the middle of these blocks. And the first one, when we started to look at it, was a very nice, very posh steel staircase, painted white, oak boards, very lovely. But it missed out one of the floors. It just didn't connect to that floor 1 level below street level. So it wasn't exactly rocket science for us as designers to figure out what you needed to do to unlock this building. We put a landing on the staircase at that floor, and you can see, before and after, we knock a small hole in the wall, drop the sill of the door, and suddenly you can get people from street level down into those fellows areas. Once we get in there, we hit that coffee shop thing. It's the thing that brings people together. It's the rocket fuel for ideas. And the coffee shop starts to happen in there. Bizarrely, this little coffee shop turns over nearly £4 million a year. It is staggering. The lovely photos with nobody in them, but when you try and get a table in there, it's a nightmare. It's been so successful. One of the things about those low basement level floors is the ceilings are quite low, so we've had to kind of really squeeze things up to try and get maximum head height. So you can see in there, there's a lovely sort of circular ceiling light, which is done in an acoustic treatment so it doesn't echo. And that's all done within 40 millimeters. So it's a really slender ceiling design just to kind of squeeze those in. I mentioned the enfilade, where we connect block to block to block to block as you're working your way down the terrace. And that lets us create those little pockets of spaces where people can meet and collaborate. Some of them about quiet working, some of them about collaboration where you actually work with each other. There was a lovely thing that they did as an institution where they're librarians, and I know there are librarians in the room. The librarians did a very unusual thing. They said, we are prepared to let our collection come out from the library and be distributed around the building. Very unusual. So the books were let loose. We could put them anywhere. The collection was let loose. We could put that anywhere. So we suddenly ended up with this fabulous wallpaper of books. We're all coming from a Zoom and Teams culture now, where we're used to seeing that as the background where we see people. But for that institution to kind of take the handbrake off and let that happen was just fabulous. And they commissioned new things. So we got this crazy plate collection arrived halfway through the project, which just new things that appear. This is the co-working space where people are collaborating, a little bit of 18th century timber work in there. You will notice, as my daughter spotted last night, toilet seats on the side there. They are prototype toilet seats, which have been industrially manufactured as people are refining designs by the Royal Designers for Industry. So you'll see there are about 35 toilet seats scattered about the space because they've got them. And rather than archive them, they've just put them out there, and they're just crazy things to have about the place. Really exciting. Now, I mentioned the second space, and that was one that actually let us work in 3 dimensions more. And instead of working with the low ceilings, we had somewhere where we could actually open up and tie 2 floors together and create this little informal lecture theatre. It links 2 floors, but then you've got the enfilade running past it. Now, that was all going to work beautifully. It was all going to go block to block to block to block to block. And then at the end of it, we unfortunately discovered halfway through the build that there was a lovely piece of 250-year-old timber work at the end that we couldn't really take out. So we had to find a solution. So you'll see at the end, rather than going into the end block, there's a painting. Because it's the RSA, this kind of was mentioned to some fellows, one of whom was Quentin Blake, who said, "Don't worry, I'll do your painting." So Quentin Blake painting to go on the end, which was really lovely. That space allows them to not just bring people together to talk and debate, that 18th century coffee shop thing again, but actually to stream that online, rather like we're doing this evening. So their Friday afternoon debates are broadcast all around the world, and fellows in any country can tune in and join in and be part of those debates. So it's a lovely project for seeing how those things could work through. Right, number 3. Closer to home this time. This is the Civic Centre campus for Coventry University. Now, this is mostly a new build project, but there is a controversial block in the middle of it. And I will tell you a little bit of the story of it. Now, it's the old Civic Centre right in the middle of Coventry. So to orientate you, you can see top left the Cathedral. You can see the Council House sitting in there. And within that red line was a bunch of buildings that belonged to the council. They've moved their office out to the station, so they've relocated happily, but leaving that site in the middle of the city left over. The university bought it, good investment for them, gives them that really prominent location right in the middle of the city. And all was going swimmingly until one of the buildings on that site got spot listed. And it's a building that dates from 1958, and I will show it to you in a moment. The architects who were working on it were having some difficulties finding a solution that would work, and the university asked us to get involved to work with them and help find an answer that would unlock the problems of this site with this listed building. So, as with everything like this, I think it has to begin with research and looking back at the history of the site and the city. So looking at Coventry, you can see as recently as 1937 on that Ordnance Survey plan, look at the size of the blocks along the streets. You can see Medievalburgage plots were surviving well into the 1930s, right in the middle of Coventry. And the site we're looking at, if you can see my mouse moving up there, is around about there. It's effectively medieval street plan. One night in November 1940, and the Luftwaffe did that to it. So you can see, if I just flick between those 2 slides, you can see what was taken away between the 1952 OS plan and the 1937 one. But what was really interesting for us was the ghosts of that medieval street plan were still there. There were still listed basements left underneath that were built on that footprint of the medieval city, and that ghost of the medieval city was surviving. If I superimpose the 1937 and the 2018 plan on top of each other, with the yellow being what we've got effectively now, you can see how radically different they were. And approaching any site here, I think as a designer, we have to go back to the bones of the city, which is a medieval city. Okay, it's become a post-war city, and it's got a whole history of post-war buildings, but actually what underpins it all is the medieval. This is a 1920s view along the side of that site, and you can see the narrow Medievalburgage plots, 6 metres wide. You can even see the odd one that's got a jettied upper story and a timber frame. It's very obviously a medieval townscape, crystallised into 18th and 19th century buildings as it moves on. Here's a photo after the Blitz, 1946, and you can see people are beginning to reoccupy the sites that were left over after the bombings. And in here, look at how those little Nissen huts and tents and shacks are working. What do they base them on? Medievalburgage plots, 6 metres wide, end onto the street. It's what British towns have been built out of forever. When the council rebuilt it, that kind of got forgotten. And that was the thing that we took away. There was a real heritage there. Despite the modern buildings that went onto the site, the medieval underpinnings were paramount. Now, before we started working on a design for it, we said, let's try and build a kind of kit of parts, a bunch of rules that working on this site would imply. And there were things like connecting public spaces, allowing access from streets to move through the site and across the site, having views of the cathedral spire, views of the clock towers around it, recognising that Medievalburgage plot and the grain of the city that goes with that, and those kind of various bits of choreography that go with it. Now, I kind of like that intellectual idea of building a kit of parts and then saying, how do we get a design that comes from that? But when you put the kit of parts together, it doesn't look particularly pretty. So that's where you've got to go to work as a designer and start tuning that. And some of those will drop down, some of them will be pulled up. You'll work more with some than others, but you've always got a kit of parts in rules you can go back to test things, and that's why I really advocate it. Now, to cut a long story short, after about 6 months' work, we came up with a design that worked with that finer grain, and we used the Medievalburgage plots to wrap the bigger things that the university needed to sit onto the site behind it, and developed a pattern of streets and squares that would link the town from the streets around the cathedral through into the new site and beyond. It was something that we kind of did quite a big presentation about and took people through very much step by step to get through that design, to actually start to appreciate how it worked. As the university's requirements sat onto it, it included things like a 400-seat lecture theatre, so a big public space, gallery spaces, public concourses on the lower floors. And then as you moved up through the building on the upper levels, it became more private, and we had a roofscape that was beginning to show that kind of grain of medieval buildings that worked with it. On the frontage, where it faced the square in front of the town hall, it was a much simpler design, and you can see here architects doing something that architects don't normally do, which is not putting something big on a corner and actually folding that corner of the building down, that sort of slightly downward slope, very sort of Scandinavian feel to it. The reason we did that was because we don't need to shout with every building. You don't need to shout when you've got the town hall next door. And when you see it from the square, just dipping that corner means that you get to borrow the rather lovely town hall clock tower, and that brings that into play in the square. And instead of blocking it, you actually drop down and let that become the focus. So use somebody else's hard work rather than us having to do it. Now, also, again, it's one of these layered projects where there's lots of little narratives on top of each other. One of the things I really liked about this was, as we started looking at it, we found that just kind of underneath that corner, before the Blitz, was this rather fabulous building, Palace Yard. Now, the cellars have survived, but obviously timber building, German incendiary bombs are not good combinations, and it got wiped out in the Blitz. But it's pretty well where the university is going to have its new front door. So we thought, how can we actually take that and bring that into a new building and actually create something that has a memory of that space? It's a really difficult thing to do without it becoming cheesy very, very quickly. So we ended up looking at this kind of timber screen that would actually wrap around the two-storey entrance space and actually pick up the gable, the pattern of gables that we'd take from those old photos in the archives. In the 1960s building that was there, a local sculptor, George Wagstaff, had one of his pieces in a water feature in the courtyard. George is now in his mid-80s, I think. Hopefully he isn't listening tonight and correcting me online, but still incredibly active as an artist. And the university have commissioned him to make another sculpture. So his first one he did in 1958 when he was 17. And he's come back to do another one in 2022, which is going down to the foundry this summer to be cast. And that is the phoenix tree, which is rising from the waters in the interior of the main reception space. So, lovely story that sculpture comes back round. It's a project full of layered narratives. Now, I talked about the listed building, and let me tell you a little bit about that just to kind of complete the story. This is it. Now, what do we feel as a consensus about that building? Are we in love? No, right. I can't. Now, again, as an architect, you try and have a degree of morality. So I kind of turn to my senior partner and say, John Burrell, incredible architect, worked with historic buildings and sensitive sites all his life. You are my moral compass. What do you think? And John sort of sniffed and said, what they list that for, and then shuffled off to do something else. That makes a really interesting point. Why was it listed? It was listed not so much because of its architecture, but because of what happened there, the people who worked there. It was the city architects department when a whole bunch of people who worked there went on to do great things elsewhere. It was almost after the building of Coventry and the big decisions after the war happened that this was built. But it has that kind of narrative importance, which is why it got listed. Now, it's an okay building. With my architecty hat on, I can start to make arguments for its qualities. But ultimately, it's not as important as the medieval cityscape around it and the fact that this is a really fascinating city and we can start to heal the city. So it's about that balancing the value of a listed building against the value of how you can begin to repair townscape. And that is not an equation that you can do with maths. You've got to really feel your way into it. The key elevation for me was this one. So this is the street coming down from the old cathedral, the ruins of the old cathedral. We've got the sandstone town hall on the right, lovely building, quite an interesting modern building on the left, and then slicing across the end of it is Civic Centre 2. And in my analysis, I felt it was much more important that that road continued and there was a link within the city into the block beyond it, rather than keeping the 1958 building intact. Now, that meant that as we developed our design, we could actually take that slice through a glazed atrium into the university site. That street then kinks and moves further into the development. I could tell a slight untruth and say we thought of it all along, but actually that alignment and the kink lines up perfectly with a cathedral spire, but we only found that out when we built the model. We said, oh, actually that really works. So it moves on the cathedral spire, and then you get the angle shift, and you move on the clock tower and tie back up. It also means that when you stand behind the high altar in the cathedral, and you have that amazing spent space looking all the way down there, you see beyond it and beyond and beyond, it will pick up on that access and it will just keep it going rather than having that 60s block across in front of it. Right, all great in theory. And then we went to see Historic England, who were wonderfully supportive, and they said, love the thinking, love the approach. Can you find a way to make it work with the 60s building? And this is the diagram that we kind of developed, where we were saying what we wanted to do was make that street work, so it would cross over, go into the site, kink, and move off further into it. Now, putting CC2 building there, that's kind of where it sits. So we'd need to take out the end 2 bays of it to make that work. So the argument was very carefully structured around If we take out those 2 bays to make the connection, we can still keep a substantial part of the building. The best architectural features of it are on the ground floor in a little glass box exhibition space, which we can keep exactly as it was. We can keep the quite interesting staircase, but we take 2 bays off the end of it. And it lets us, inside the atrium of the new building, keep it and actually have it as a building within a building. So it kind of is retained within the interior of the new build as we developed it. I felt very much that that was an appropriate thing to do, and we worked very hard to kind of develop that argument. It was supported by Historic England. Sadly, it wasn't quite seen that way by the 20th Century Society, who described my design as possibly the worst scheme involving a listed building in living memory. I can't begin to tell you how hurtful something like that is when you've spent 2 years of your life working yourself to death to trying to get something which is a solution that pleases everybody. That's the hard side of my job. Fortunately, the council didn't see it that way, and they supported it, and it got planning permission. That's the design as it's developed, and that's how it's going to look. And I think that street continuing, I still think it was the right thing to do. You can just see it at ground floor in there. The box retains, and as you go into the building, you can still see the original set in there. But just goes to show, not everybody is going to see it the same way, and you've got to have a fairly thick skin. I'm not very good at that, but it was an interesting chapter. Right, I'm going to finish with 2 buildings at opposite ends of the country, showing very different problems. This one is the Guildhall in York. Now, if you Google York images, you'll either get the Minster or you'll get the Guildhall seen from the river. It's a series of buildings fronting the River Ouse, dating from about 1460 with the Guildhall, which you can see kind of sitting in there, through to sort of 19th century Grade 2 star listed. Oh, this is another collector's item where you get Grade 1, Grade 2 star, Grade 2 on the same site. Council chamber sits in there, a tower on the corner, just an amazing collection of buildings. But what got me really excited when we first came across it was this archway. Can you see that little arch down there? Guess what that is? That's the Roman road into the city from the harbour. Now, single moments when the world changes. The Emperor Constantine's father dies, the message comes to him, your father's dead, what are you going to do? You're going to fight to be emperor. He does, goes on, achieves power, converts the emperor to Christianity. The world changes with a message that went through that archway up that road. How cool is that? That is just hair on the back of your neck moment. Combine that with the 1460 Guildhall, an amazing 19th century expression of civic pride, and the opportunity to try and figure out how you stitch this together and give it a future, because the City Council moved out 5 years ago. That's the project. So we do what we always do, we start drawing. These are my competition sketches. There's York, you can see the Minster in orange, you can see the castle in orange, and you can see the Guildhall site in yellow, sitting on the river there. If you zoom in, you can see that as part of a network of public spaces around it, roads, streets, squares. And actually, when you look at that diagram, streets, squares, alleys, I go back to my architectural education and studying in Venice, and you could blink, and that could be a series of streets and squares just off the Grand Canal, couldn't it? It's got that kind of density of blocks and urban space, which is almost Venetian, but it's another medieval city. It's a medieval city of York. There are complications that come with that, particularly when you've got to build something. There are only 2 ways onto the site, both of which are only marginally bigger than the doorway that we just came through. So anything big that arrives has to come in by boat. So we've had to build it substantially from the water, with big things coming in on a barge, lifted from a crane and placed onto the site so that we don't take anything along the main shopping street. The Guildhall itself It's an amazing space, timber roof, huge 600mm cross-section oak columns. But not quite as honest as it seems. Rather like Coventry, it got blitzed in the war. So this is 1941, and we've got the assizes sitting in the ruins of the Guildhall because they weren't going to be beaten by those bloody Germans. And dogged Yorkshire spirit, they carried on. What's also interesting there is you can see what happens when you put an incendiary bomb up against a 600mm square oak section. The winner is the oak cross-section. But when they came to rebuild it after the war, let's go back a slide. When they came to rebuild it after the war, trying to find pieces of oak like that was not easy. So somehow they got something, but obviously as they've seasoned, they've twisted and moved out of shape and become slightly distorted. So it's a really interesting space. But to give it a future, it needs to be able to hold events like this, where you've got something happening, music or speech or something going on. And the shell of the building is 600 years old, and there aren't enough fire escapes with it. So we had to negotiate very, very carefully with English Heritage to let us create this new opening underneath one of the doorways along the side to actually get people out in an emergency. And that lets you use it as a space for 400 people, which is what it was built to do, but it lets you do it safely in a 21st century way. It's a very sustainable space. We've put new LED lighting into it. Our heating system takes the water from the river, puts that through a heat exchanger, and then heats and cools the building like that. Hugely sustainable. Where we've put new pieces of furniture into it, we've used appropriate materials, English oak, fabrics woven locally. To get the things that you need, rather like we've come in tonight through the front door with the loos, etc., cloakrooms, we've had to use the spaces around it, so putting glass roofs on those so that they become part of that composition is part of the challenge, as is where we've got the existing Victorian fabric, just celebrating it for the beauty that it is, just the fact that all of those cornices and dado mouldings are flush with the plane of the wall, which is great, really unusual. So everything is recessed and just putting that back the way it was. As part of the project, we've put some new build spaces into it at this end, on the end of the tower, where there's a little gap between it and the next door building. And putting those new spaces in lets us put things like staircases and toilets and air conditioning plant where we need it, and getting those things into there so that we create this sort of topography at the other end of the site of public spaces with terraces overlooking the river. And lets the city put more functions into there. One thing that's quite interesting with York is that river floods quite significantly. So you've got a 5-metre flood range on it. So you can see that blue, you can't quite see it on there, going up to around about where that number 8 is about the flood range. It's a huge, huge thing. So it all has to be designed to cope with that. But then around it, it has that townscape, and go back to that first sketch of the streets and squares and how we can stitch the spaces around those historic buildings back into its townscape so that these become things that people use, is another key mission of that project. Oh, that's interesting. Wasn't expecting that, forgive me. There we go. Let's verifying my Microsoft PowerPoint. Okay, let's try that again. Here we go. Nope, that's not that one. We are Creative Conservation, that's us. I was just going to say, maybe it's a Freudian thing actually. This week, the building's supposed to be finished, and my colleagues are up there snagging it as we speak. So let's hope that isn't, sorry, an error occurred. Let's hope that isn't prophetic. Come on, please work. Yay, there we go. Let's hope that's not prophetic and they do get to hand the building over this week, which will be lovely. Right, final one you'll be pleased to hear. And this goes to the far end of the country. And again, a 19th century building, but I think is really important because it shows what happens when communities come together around pieces of architecture. This is a theatre for Hall for Cornwall in Truro. And again, I don't know Truro particularly well, so when the competition was announced, I start drawing, and I kind of did a series of little sketches zooming in. So you can see the plan of the city there with the rivers that flow down to the sea at the estuary. Those river valleys are green, and you can just see a little yellow dot in there. That's our site as the two rivers come together. Zoom in. City centre, we can see the blocks. There's the block that the theatre sits in. Zoom in again. We can put in public squares. Go again. We can put in the streets that follow the lines of the rivers, the riparian streets. Go again. We can put the next grain of little alleyways, the oakways that cross over. And that's the lovely thing about working in English cities with some history to them, is you get this amazing weave, and you can just go layer after layer after layer after layer. And once you're working within that, as a designer, it kind of solves itself. What are you going to do? You're going to actually get connections that work in the same directions. So that's the site of the theatre itself. It's in the middle of that block. There's a city with a tradition of alleys that work through things. Why wouldn't we try and put an alley through the theatre? On each side of it, there's a historic listed building. So on Boscawen Street, there's this very grand city hall on this side, which has this fabulous hyper-style columned hall in granite underneath it. Absolutely amazing building. On the other side, back quay, is the old customs house over there. And in between the two was originally the market hall. As with many of these buildings, it goes on to do all sorts of funny things in its life. It was a market hall. Strangely, it was also a roller disco at one stage. Obviously a thing about our projects and roller discos. It was a dance hall. It was a rifle range. How about that? Do you imagine people shooting in the middle of Truro in this sort of indoor environment? But a really exciting historic narrative to work with. Park that for a second. Let's think about theatres. Now, classical theatre is a diagram like that. Proscenium, we don't know what they work with. There's actually rather a nice one on the cliffs in Cornwall. The medieval theatre was about the theatre coming to you in your village, the pageant wagon that would arrive, everybody would gather around it. It solidifies into a building with the Elizabethan theatre, where you've got a stage and we're starting to see something that we recognise. But in Cornwall, there was something really interesting. Have anybody come across something called the Plenan Gwari before? It's a unique Cornish dramatic tradition. It's a form of theatre, and it works in a circle. So you look at that and you think, well, okay, that's fine. I've got a theatre with a circle around it. It's a theatre in the round, isn't it? No, it goes the opposite way round. The audience sits in the middle, and the play rotates around in 360 degrees around them. Really out there, thoroughly unique as an architectural form. Here's one of the two surviving ones at St Just. And you can see the audience in the middle and the revolving play. But it's all this thing about movement, people moving. Now, how can we take that back to Hall for Cornwall? That was the building before we started working on it. And the rather fabulous theatre director who drove the project forward as a sort of force of will, Julian, said, I want you to make a theatre for me where people feel happy throwing cabbages. That was his brief. And you can see the space he'd got. It was enormous. It was kind of built for rock concerts. It's a 17-metre wide proscenium. And if you're an actor and you're talking to an audience, you're trying to make eye contact, talk to people, work your way around the audience, do that. Simon Callow, when he's on stage in the old Hall for Cornwall, was absolutely knackered because he's got 17 metres. He's doing his Dickens show. Poor guy needs to lie down in the darkened room when he's finished because it's so hard work to do it. So what we tried to do was actually pull that in and make it a much more intense space. More of that in a second. But with that, we wanted to get this idea of people moving and this idea of the opeway, the little walkway that we could carry through. And it occurred to us, could we actually wrap a walkway for the public around the back of the theatre that they can go through day in, day out. And if there's a show on, it closes down, the theatre shuts down and starts to work. But when there's not a show on, you can just walk through with your shopping on the way from Marks and Spencer's to the car park, and you can see what's going on. If there's a band tuning up, you can hear them doing a sound check. If people are rigging lights, you can see that happening. It's the theatre of the theatre, and actually democratising that as something that is available to everybody. How exciting is that? Very excited about this. So, the thing that would make it work was the cross-section of the theatre, putting these 3 tiers of seats into it, having this walkway across the back that would actually let people move through and actually see into the space. It becomes really complicated when the show starts, but I'll tell you about that in a sec. But then we start to create a much more high-intensity, high-definition auditorium. Everybody pulls in, the wings wrap round, the scale drops, so that when you're on stage, you've actually got that wall of people around you. And as an actor, it's just a great place to work. Now, there is another issue with this project, which is the way that theatres work these days, is that if you are taking a piece of touring production, you can stipulate, if you're a big theatre, that nobody else nearby gets it, so you've got a monopoly. Now, unfortunately, the theatre in Plymouth had more seats than Truro, so they could say, right, we'll have that one. That's not going down the road to Truro. So we had to have one more seat than Plymouth. So we worked very hard to have 1,274, I think it was in the end, but it had to have one more. And there it is, just before Christmas, when it was finished, ready for their Christmas show. Big thing about materials, Helen, project architect, Mark and I, who worked on it, we were all really interested in the idea of natural materials. We didn't want to have plasterboard in this thing. We want to have something which is all about granite, wood, stone, and the fabrics that we designed were based on the moss patterns that we could find on the moors. So we've got this lovely sort of greeny grey mottled fabric that some amazing people helped us use for the seats. Again, Julian's brief was, we want to throw cabbages. We do not want plush red velvet seats. It has to be about Cornwall. It's about water, mountains, timber, natural materials. And there they are as they've gone in. Now, I said that the problem you get with having this kind of democratic space that people can move in and out of all the time is that when you actually get showtime and you want to close it down, you've got to find a way to do it. And we've got these giant arches, you can see there, which are 6 meters high, so give you a clue, that's around about the size of one of those windows. But we had a big building above it, so we were able to kind of put a portcullis, this huge steel sliding door that slides up above it. So come showtime, 3 of these giant portcullises drop and close down. And then all the timber doors shut down to give you a second layer of acoustics. And then the acoustic curtains drop. So 5 minutes to go, 3 minutes to go, 2 minutes to go, 1 minute to go. The building is just getting ready for the show. And it's, again, the theatre of theatre. But when everything's open, you sit in your seat, you can see not just the stonework of the old market hall, where you can see the ring where the bull was tied, but you can see out beyond it, down that sort of colonnade there, through the columned hall, and you can see the people moving on Boscawen Street and in the market square on the other side. Come to showtime, it closes down, focus more and more and more onto the stage, and then you're good to go. Thing I'm most pleased with, I just love that idea that you can walk through there with your shopping and you watch that theatre living and breathing. It brings amazing historic spaces back to life, but it brings them back to life with a purpose, so that they are ingrained in the life of that theatre, and the theatre is ingrained in the life of the city and the county it serves. And yeah, I'm really proud of that. We heard today it's been shortlisted for a couple of prizes, which is lovely. And that's where I'm going to leave it. Hopefully that's shown you a little bit about what creative conservation can do. When we look at buildings, we mustn't look at them as being defined by their history in a negative way, but empowered by their history in a way that we can take them forward creatively, give them new leases of life. That's what sustainability really means. It's not just about low energy light bulbs, it's about a future for our heritage. Thank you.
Aidan, that was fabulous. Thank you so much indeed. Now, Aidan did say he'd take questions if anybody wants to ask any questions quickly. Julian.
Hello, Julian.
Surely the river used to come straight past,
Yes, it did.
and the boats would be loading up in the middle.
Yes.
Why didn't they take the opportunity to put the water back?
Oh, well, that's a cause célèbre in Truro at the moment. If you look at the local paper, I'm trying to remember what it's called, somebody sent it to me this week. They're saying, why don't we open up Back Quay again? The reason they effectively culverted the river in that last section is because it's very tidal and it stinks like an otter at low tide. And they didn't want that to have that in their marketplace. But I do think there are things they can do with it, and they can do more with it. What I really found fascinating about it was, again, I talked about some of the uses of the building. It was also a fire station. So if that shot you saw where there's the old building with the waterfront in front of it and a little bit of road outside, the fire engine was in there. It's got to come out in an emergency. It's got to do a 3-point turn without going into the water, and then it's got to head off parallel to the street front. So I don't think that horse is kind of finished running yet. I think things will happen on Back Quay in Truro. Jeff. Oh. No. Right, let me come back to Truro, because Truro was a really good school day. And I think as an architect, you have to keep learning. You do not know it all. Every day of my life, I meet people who are much cleverer than I am with things to teach me. And Truro was a great case in point. We did a couple of workshops with a local disability group who came to advise us. And I thought I understood what regulations were and how we could make an auditorium work. Boy, was it a school day. I hadn't got a clue. Things that I had no idea about were, we were trying to grade all the surfaces so that if you were in a wheelchair, you could actually get everywhere reasonably straightforwardly without having to go up and down in some kind of lift or other. What I hadn't realised was quite how difficult a crossfall is if you're tilting your chair to one side, and actually trying to design it so that you avoided all of those. Massive thing that I learnt about. Big thing with that building was changing places loos, which are effectively changing areas for adults. So if you've got somebody with movement problems and they need to be helped to stay clean, you've got a room with a hoist that can do that. Really hard thing to put into a historic building, because to do it by the book, you need a space, half the size of that stage. It's really big. But we found a way that we could find a slightly cut down version, and we could make that work in there, so that went into it. Something else that I really didn't realise was how you put spaces for disabled people into an auditorium. And I've always thought, well, I've got to put 4 spaces in, I'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, job done. No. We're all different. Some people are quite happy being at the front. Some people want to be at the back. Some people want to be at the middle. And actually giving that choice to people was the single most important thing we could do. And actually, I'm really proud of that. When we went to the premiere, one of the things that I really loved was seeing how somebody in a chair could actually put their chair in forwards, and they could actually sit level with the person they went with, and their head heights were the same, so they could laugh at the jokes together and nudge each other. And I would not have been able to do that as a designer without that workshop, with that group of people. And boy, was it humbling, and boy, was it a good school day.
It's interesting hearing you say what happened to Europe and how at the beginning of the show, we had different things dropping down. What are the security and safety aspects of that?
We have to be a little bit careful, because these things are they're one set of shutters are about fire, and another set are about acoustics, and another are about refining the acoustics. So the big heavyweight ones, those portcullises, they're effectively the doors that you put into a film sound set. So they are massively acoustically sealed, so you can have a rock band inside and not hear a thing on the other side. So they're basically filled with lead. So we're rather careful about moving these things up and down in a building. The way we've done it is actually that you have the stewards who are part of the building. They kind of police it, and they sort of say, look, in your seat, if you can't come that way, there's another pass door that takes you around the other way. So we do have to manage it quite carefully. But the flip side of that is, boy, is it dramatic, because you see these huge things coming down, and then you see the shutters go, and then you see the fabric that just gives you the finishing touch on the acoustic. And it's a really special auditorium. Sorry, you. We are kind of in mid-project with that. It's about a master plan for Bromsgrove and looking at potential for the town. So a lot of it is stitching together work that's been done before, which is quite interesting. We're not quite ready to publish it yet. It's coming soon. But the things that I've learnt from Bromsgrove is just quite what a great town centre you've got. Great collection of buildings. Really lovely townscape. There are challenges, but everywhere has challenges. Most of them are to do with vehicles. And in a sustainable world, is that a tidal wave that's going to go, or is it going to see it keeping going? Those are the things we've got to wrestle with. And the thing that's so horrible is that you kind of get skewed by an immediate problem and not see the 20, 40, 100-year issue that's going to go with it. And I think those are the things that Bromsgrove looks into, but it's a really interesting place. It's got that Truro grain, hasn't it, where you've got the riparian road that follows the stream. Remind me what the stream's called. Spaceborne Brook, thank you, that goes through the middle. And then you've got this finer filigree of connections that go the other way across it, so it's a warp and weft town. But for me, it's a classic Italian hill town. Everything fronts onto the high street. That's where you put your posh frock on, and you get the sort of slightly rougher edges around the back. But that means you've got opportunities to actually look at how that's healed and how that kind of outward-facing side, away from a town's high street, is something where smaller developments could actually begin to put that right. And you've got bags of precedents for doing that beautifully sort of all over London, where people are looking at little pocket sites and pocket developments and muse courts and little pocket parks and bits of landscape. And that's what I see as being, in a nutshell, without wanting to give the game away, kind of the future there.
Brilliant. Well, I think you'll all agree that Aidan's given us a fantastic talk today, very inspiring, and I love the way that you start so far back to do what you want to do going forward, and that really, I think for me, and I'm sure for other people here, is inspiring. And it's a shame you can't open the book a little bit more about Bromsgrove, but we're very much looking forward to see what might happen. And talking about books, as a thank you, I'd like to present you with the new history of Bromsgrove. So
Thank you.
Both the authors are here this evening.
Thank you, both authors. I will I'll trouble you for an autograph. Strangely enough, I was just looking at that thinking, I wonder if I've got 25 quid in my wallet. So thank you very much. It's really kind.
And on that note, I'd also like to thank Aidan. In lieu of a fee, he's donating some money to the Friends of St John's. So we're very grateful to that. St John's Church, as you all know, we're looking at how we can take a medieval building and use it for the future. So certainly a lot of what Aidan said this evening is something that we'd like to apply up at St John's. We'll probably pick your brain about that at some point. So, yeah, thank you very much. If we can all give Aidan another round of applause.
Thank you very much.
And just on the note of the books, the authors are both here, and if anybody would like to buy a book and they do have £25 in their pocket, the books are available just across the way. John Weston will help you there. There's also an array of books from the Bromsgrove Society's bookstall. And please do join us for a glass of wine. Aidan's going to stay around if anybody's got any questions. And lovely to see everybody, as I said before, and hope to have a chat with you afterwards. But thank you very much for coming this evening. And once again, can we just say thank you to Aidan. Thank you.